Petra Salazar had been tied to the post outside the cantina for 6 hours before the stranger rode into town. And in that time, she had learned exactly how little her life was worth to the 5 men who guarded her. She was 26, gaunt in the specific way that came from months of genuine hunger rather than mere poverty, and her crime. The single crime that had brought 5 armed men to drag her into the Pueblo's dusty central square and bind her wrists to a weathered hitching post, was the theft of 1 bullet from the general store's poorly guarded supply shed. 1 bullet, meant for the rabbit snares she'd been running along the dry riverbed for weeks, the only reliable source of meat left to her since the drought had taken what little her family's small plot of land could still produce. The men who held her answered to Vallejo, though Vallejo himself had ridden out that morning to collect on debts in a neighboring settlement, leaving his 5 subordinates to guard both the Pueblo and whatever petty justice they'd decided the situation required. They were drunk by midday, passing a bottle of mezcal between them with the loose, dangerous carelessness of men who had never once been made to answer for anything, their own wanted posters, copies of the same bounty notices that hung in territorial marshal offices 3 counties in every direction, scattered carelessly beneath that bottle on an overturned supply crate, as though the paper proof of their own crimes carried no more weight to them than kindling. Petra had stopped asking for water an hour earlier, understanding with a specific, exhausted clarity that her requests only amused them further. She had resigned herself, sitting in the dust with the sun beating down on a Pueblo that had, in the 18 months since Vallali's men first arrived, become a place where no formal law had reached in longer than anyone still living there could clearly remember. It was the sound of a single horse, unhurried and deliberate, that first drew her attention away from her own exhaustion. A black horse moving down the Pueblo's main street at a slow, measured walk, carrying a rider who made no attempt to hide his approach and no attempt, either, to hurry it. If a hook like that already has you leaning forward, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps the story reach more people, and I read every single comment, so tell me, do you think 1 man alone stands a chance against 5 armed, drunk gunmen in broad daylight? Let's find out exactly what happened when that stranger reached the square. The stranger dismounted his horse at the edge of the square with the same unhurried economy that had defined his approach, tying the animal loosely to a fence post rather than any hitching rail, as though he expected to need it again soon and didn't intend to waste time on unnecessary knots. He wore a plain gray coat, dust-worn from considerable travel, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low enough to shade his face without fully obscuring it, and carried, visible at his hip, a single revolver that he made no move to draw as he walked, with the same measured, unbothered pace, directly toward the 5 men gathered around the bound woman. He said nothing for a long moment once he'd reached them, simply standing at a distance that placed him close enough to see clearly, far enough to suggest no immediate aggression, and studied the scene before him with an expression the 5 men found, almost immediately and almost universally, considerably more unsettling than any shout or drawn weapon might have produced. "This your business, stranger?" the largest of the 5 men said finally, a broad-shouldered man the others called Reyes, setting down the mezcal bottle with the specific, exaggerated confidence of a man who genuinely believed his numbers made the outcome of any confrontation a foregone conclusion. "Woman's a thief. We're handling it proper." "Proper," the stranger repeated, his voice carrying a flat, quiet evenness that gave away nothing of what he actually thought of that word. "Tied to a post in the sun for 6 hours over a single bullet. That your idea of proper justice? Or just the version you settled on because nobody in 3 counties is left to tell you otherwise?" Reyes's expression shifted from confident amusement into something considerably colder. "You want to ride on through, stranger, that's your business. You want to make this your business instead, that's a different conversation entirely, and I don't believe you understand what you're actually walking into." "I understand precisely what I'm walking into," the stranger said. 5 men, drunk since midday judging by that bottle, holding a starving woman over a bullet while your own wanted posters sit uncovered on that crate behind you. Like you've forgotten what happens to men who stop being careful about who sees proof of their crimes. The silence that followed carried a specific, genuine tension that made even Petra, exhausted and dehydrated as she was, understand that something in the stranger's flat, unhurried certainty had genuinely unsettled men who had spent 18 months believing themselves entirely beyond consequence. "Cut her loose," the stranger said. "Now." And then the five of you can decide amongst yourselves whether today's the day you find out exactly how much your numbers are actually worth against a man who isn't drunk on mezcal and doesn't particularly care how many of you there are." Reyes laughed, though something in the sound carried considerably less genuine confidence than it had a moment earlier. 5 against 1, stranger. You want to reconsider that math before somebody makes you regret the arithmetic. "I've already done the arithmetic," the stranger said. "I did it the moment I rode into the square and counted exactly how many of you were sober enough to actually shoot straight. I count 2, judging by how that bottle's been handled. I'd suggest you consider very carefully whether those are odds worth dying over before this conversation goes any further." It was the second man from the left, younger than the others, considerably less composed, who broke first, his hand moving toward his own holstered weapon with a speed that betrayed genuine panic rather than any calculated decision. And the stranger's response came with a precision that left every witness in that square, including Petra herself, watching with the specific, stunned disbelief of people witnessing something they would spend considerable time afterward trying to fully describe to others. The gunfight, once it began, lasted less than 11 seconds. The stranger's revolver cleared its holster with a speed that seemed to defy the same unhurried, deliberate quality that had defined every other movement he'd made since dismounting his horse, and his first shot struck the young gunman's weapon directly from his hand before the man had fully cleared his own holster, the bullet ringing off metal with a sound that echoed across the square and left the young man staring at his own empty, stinging hand with genuine shock. Reyes and a second man both drew in the same instant, and the stranger's next 2 shots came in rapid, precise succession. Not aimed at either man directly, but at the ground immediately before their feet, kicking up dust and forcing both men to stumble backward in genuine, instinctive alarm rather than continuing their draw. The remaining 2 men, watching 3 of their companions already disarmed or scattered within the space of a few seconds, made the specific, practical calculation that Reyes himself had failed to make quickly enough, dropping their own weapons and raising their hands with the particular haste of men who had just understood, with total clarity, exactly how badly they'd misjudged the stranger standing before them. Reyes alone remained standing with his weapon still in hand, though the stranger's revolver was already leveled directly at him, with an unwavering steadiness that made clear exactly how little chance remained for any further resistance. "Drop it," the stranger said, "or become the first man in this Pueblo to learn today exactly how precisely I aim when I'm not simply trying to make a point." Reyes dropped his weapon. That gunfight is exactly the kind of precision and control this whole story is going to be built on, so if it landed for you, drop a comment with the word 11, because I think that number's about to matter considerably more than a simple count of seconds. And if this story's earning your attention so far, go ahead and subscribe now. The stranger's not done with this Pueblo yet. The stranger freed Petra himself, cutting the rope binding her wrists with a small blade he produced from his boot, and helped her to her feet with a careful, genuinely gentle attention that stood in stark contrast to the precise, controlled violence he'd just demonstrated moments earlier. "You're the woman who took the bullet," he said, though it carried less the quality of a question than a simple, already understood fact. "For rabbit snares," Petra said, her voice carrying the specific rawness of 6 hours without water. "I have a family, senor. My mother, my younger brothers. The drought's taken nearly everything else we had. I understand what I did was theft, regardless of the reason behind it. Hunger's not a crime deserving 6 hours tied to a post in the sun," the stranger said. "Whatever else these men believed they were enforcing today, it wasn't justice." He turned to the 5 disarmed, considerably chastened men still gathered in the square. "You'll leave this Pueblo," he said. "Now, on foot, since I don't believe any of you deserve to keep the horses you've likely stolen from people considerably less able to defend themselves than I've proven myself to be. Tell Vallejo, when you find him, that the Pueblo he's been terrorizing for 18 months has a new problem he hasn't yet properly accounted for." The 5 men departed on foot within the hour, disarmed and considerably more subdued than their earlier drunk confidence had suggested they were capable of, and the stranger remained behind in the square, watching them go with the same flat, unhurried attention he'd brought to every other moment of that afternoon's confrontation. It was an older woman named Conpan who first approached Petra once the immediate danger had passed, offering silent, practical hospitality without any of the extensive questioning Petra might reasonably have expected given the considerable spectacle that had just unfolded in the Pueblo's central square. Conpan lived alone in a small adobe house at the Pueblo's edge, her own husband and 2 sons lost, over the preceding decade, to a combination of illness and the same general lawlessness that had allowed men like Vallejo to eventually claim informal control over the settlement. And she offered Petra water, food, and a quiet corner of her modest home with the specific, unhurried generosity of a woman who had long ago decided that small, unquestioning kindness represented the only meaningful resistance still available to her against circumstances she could no longer directly control. The stranger himself remained in the Pueblo over the following days, though he offered no extensive explanation for his continued presence, spending his time in careful, deliberate observation of the settlement's layout, its handful of remaining residents, and the specific approaches by which Valali's men had historically entered and exited the square. "You're expecting him to return," Petra said on the second evening, finding the stranger seated outside Conpan's small house cleaning his revolver with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to everything else. "A man like Vallejo doesn't let 5 of his own men get disarmed and sent home on foot without answering it directly," the stranger said. "He'll come back, and considerably better armed and prepared than his men were this afternoon. I'd rather be ready for that than surprised by it." "Why does this matter to you?" Petra asked. "You rode into a Pueblo you'd never seen before, for a woman you'd never met, over a single stolen bullet. I don't understand what you actually stand to gain from any of this." The stranger considered the question for a long moment, his hands never pausing in their careful work on the revolver. "Some debts don't require personal history to matter," he said finally. "I've seen what happens to places law abandons, and to the people left behind when it does. I don't need a personal stake in your particular circumstances to understand that what happened to you today was wrong, and that somebody needed to be the one to say so directly with more than just words. Now you know exactly what kind of man rode into that Pueblo, and if you're already convinced Valali's return is going to be considerably more dangerous than his men's first attempt, comment Vallejo below. If you think the stranger's already got everything under control regardless of what comes next, comment no chance instead. I want to see which side of this story has you more convinced. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because Valali's return is coming, and it's bringing considerably more men than the stranger faced the first time. Vallejo returned to the Pueblo 4 days later, exactly as the stranger had anticipated, though the scale of his response exceeded even the stranger's own careful preparations. 7 armed men riding in formation behind him, considerably more sober and considerably more disciplined than the 5 subordinates who'd first confronted Petra, and Vallejo himself at their head, a broad, heavily scarred man whose reputation across 3 counties had been built on a specific, thorough ruthlessness that made clear exactly why his subordinates had operated with such careless confidence in his absence. The stranger observed their approach from a considerable distance, having positioned himself, in the days since his arrival, with a careful understanding of the Pueblo's surrounding terrain that few of its actual long-time residents had ever bothered to develop. He understood, watching 7 armed riders approach across open ground, exactly why confronting them directly in the Pueblo's central square, the same open space where he'd faced their 5 subordinates days earlier, would represent a genuinely different and considerably more dangerous proposition against these particular numbers. He made his decision within minutes of spotting their approach, abandoning the square entirely and leading their eventual pursuit, through a careful trail of deliberately visible tracks, toward a narrow rock-walled wash roughly a mile beyond the Pueblo's northern edge, terrain he had scouted specifically during his days of preparation, understanding its particular value as a place where 7 men's numerical advantage would count for considerably less than the specific tactical value of controlled, elevated positioning. Valali's men followed the tracks without hesitation, their confidence in their own considerable numbers apparently blinding them to the specific tactical risk of pursuing an unknown enemy into unfamiliar, narrow terrain. A mistake the stranger had anticipated with the same careful, methodical precision he brought to every other aspect of his approach. The wash itself ran roughly 200 yards between steep rock walls barely wide enough for 3 riders to pass abreast, narrowing considerably at its midpoint into a passage where the stranger had positioned himself, hours earlier, in a concealed vantage point roughly 30 feet above the wash's floor, offering him clear sightlines across the entire narrow passage while remaining almost entirely invisible to anyone approaching from ground level. Valali's 7 men entered the wash in a loose column, their earlier confidence gradually giving way to the specific, growing unease that comes from pursuing an unseen enemy into genuinely unfamiliar terrain, and the stranger allowed them to advance nearly to the wash's narrowest point before making his presence known. "That's far enough," he called down, his voice carrying easily across the narrow rock walls with an echo that made his precise location considerably difficult to immediately identify. 7 of you in a passage this narrow means you're standing in exactly the kind of formation where numbers stop mattering nearly as much as you've apparently been counting on. Valale himself, at the column's head, reined his horse to a stop with a controlled, deliberate calm that made clear he possessed considerably more genuine tactical understanding than his subordinates had displayed days earlier. "You've got one position, stranger, however well you've chosen it. I've got 7 men who'll find you eventually, regardless of how clever your terrain happens to be. You've got 7 men bunched into a passage barely wide enough for 3 abreast," the stranger said. "Which means, from where I'm sitting, I've got considerably better odds than the arithmetic you're apparently still counting on. I'd suggest you consider, the same way your men should have considered 4 days ago, whether this confrontation is genuinely worth what it's about to cost you. We're heading into the confrontation now, and I promise the payoff is worth every minute you've spent getting here. If you want to see whether the stranger's terrain advantage actually holds against 7 armed men, subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss it. Drop a comment with one word for how you think this ends: surrender, bloodshed, or escape. Let's find out together." Valali's response came not through direct confrontation, but through a coordinated attempt at flanking maneuver, 3 of his men breaking from the column to attempt scaling the wash's rock walls at a point roughly 40 yards back, understanding, with the same tactical competence Valale himself had displayed, that a single elevated position, however well chosen, remained vulnerable to a properly coordinated approach from multiple directions simultaneously. The stranger had anticipated exactly this response, having selected his position specifically for its command of not simply the wash's narrow floor, but the specific, limited approaches by which any flanking attempt might realistically succeed. His first shots, once the 3 flanking men began their climb, struck the rock immediately beside each man's handholds in rapid, precise succession, close enough to make the genuine danger of continuing entirely clear, without directly striking any of the 3 men themselves. "Next shots won't miss," the stranger called down, his voice carrying the same flat, controlled certainty that had first unsettled Reyes and his companions days earlier. "I've given every one of you considerably more mercy than your own reputation across these 3 counties has ever extended to anyone else. I'd suggest you not mistake that mercy for an absence of genuine capability." The 3 flanking men retreated from their climbing attempt with visible, genuine haste, and Valale, watching his tactical approach collapse with the same efficient precision that had defined every other aspect of the stranger's conduct since arriving in the Pueblo, made the specific calculation that his subordinates had failed to make quickly enough days earlier. "What do you actually want, stranger?" Valale called out, his own considerable confidence finally cracking under the accumulated weight of a confrontation that had proceeded almost entirely according to an opponent's careful planning rather than his own. "You've made your point. 5 of my men, now 7 more, all humiliated without a single genuine casualty on either side. What's the actual price of ending this?" "Surrender," the stranger said. "All 7 of you, weapons dropped, hands raised, prepared to answer for whatever specific crimes those wanted posters your own men left uncovered in that square happen to document. I understand you likely believe surrender represents a genuine humiliation. I'd suggest, given the actual alternative currently available to you, that humiliation is considerably preferable to what happens if this confrontation continues much longer." Valali's surrender, once it came, arrived with the same specific, calculated pragmatism that had built his considerable reputation across 3 counties. A man who understood, with genuine clarity, exactly when a tactical position had become untenable, regardless of how much his own pride resisted that particular acknowledgement. The stranger descended from his elevated position only once all 8 men, Valale and his 7 subordinates, had fully disarmed and demonstrated, through careful, deliberate compliance, that no further resistance remained genuinely possible. He bound each man's wrists with the same efficient, practical competence he'd demonstrated throughout every other aspect of his approach, and produced, from a saddlebag he'd retrieved from where his horse waited at the wash's entrance, the same wanted posters that had sat carelessly beneath a mezcal bottle in the Pueblo square days earlier, documentation he'd apparently gathered in the intervening days, specifically for exactly this purpose. He pinned each poster directly to its corresponding man's clothing, a specific and deliberately ironic gesture that made clear, without requiring any additional explanation, exactly what proof would accompany these men to whatever formal justice awaited them. "You'll walk to the territorial marshal's office in Redondo Crossing," the stranger told Vallejo, once all 8 men had been secured and marked. 2 days' journey on foot, which I understand represents considerably more discomfort than you or your men have grown accustomed to enduring. I'd suggest you consider that discomfort a genuinely mild consequence, given what your own wanted posters document about the actual scope of your crimes across these 3 counties. "And if we don't make that journey?" Vallejo asked, though something in his own considerably diminished confidence suggested he already understood the answer. "Then I'll be considerably less inclined toward mercy the next time our paths cross," the stranger said. "I'd suggest, given today's demonstration of exactly how thoroughly your own tactical advantages tend to collapse against genuine preparation, that you not test that particular possibility directly. If that resolution landed for you, go ahead and like this video right now. It's the single biggest thing that tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. And comment below. Do you think Vallejo actually makes that journey to the marshal? Or does he try something else entirely once the stranger's out of sight? I want to hear your honest take. Now, let's finish this story. The stranger returned to the Pueblo that same evening, finding Petra and Conpan waiting with the specific, cautious hope of people who had spent the preceding days genuinely uncertain whether the confrontation in the wash would end in their continued safety or in a considerably darker outcome. "They're gone," the stranger said simply, settling into the small chair Conpan offered him outside her modest home, bound, marked with their own wanted posters, and walking toward the territorial marshal's office in Redondo Crossing. "I don't believe they'll return to trouble this Pueblo again, though I'd suggest maintaining some genuine caution regardless, given how thoroughly Valali's reputation was built on exactly the kind of persistence that makes complete certainty difficult to promise." "You could have simply killed them," Petra said, watching him with an expression that carried genuine, searching curiosity beneath her evident relief. 8 armed men who'd terrorized this Pueblo for 18 months. I don't believe anyone in 3 counties would have questioned that particular outcome, given everything they've apparently done to earn it. "I could have," the stranger acknowledged. "I chose considerably differently because I've seen what happens to men who mistake violence for justice, and I've come to believe there's a meaningful difference between the two, even when the line separating them sometimes feels considerably thinner than either deserves. Those men will answer for their crimes through whatever formal justice the territorial marshal's office is still capable of providing. That answer means considerably more, in the long term, than anything I might have accomplished through simple killing." Conpan, listening from the doorway with her usual quiet attention, offered the stranger a plate of food without comment, understanding, with the same silent solidarity that had first drawn Petra into her care, exactly what kind of gratitude required no extensive words to properly convey. The stranger remained in the Pueblo for 3 additional days, helping the settlement's remaining residents begin the considerable work of rebuilding whatever genuine community structure Valali's 18 months of informal control had systematically eroded, assisting with repairs to the Pueblo's small church, helping establish a rotating watch system among the settlement's remaining able-bodied men, and offering, in careful, practical fragments, guidance on exactly how the Pueblo might eventually petition the territorial government for the kind of formal law enforcement presence that had abandoned them so completely in the years before his arrival. He said little about his own history throughout those 3 days, deflecting Petra's occasional careful questions with the same flat, unhurried evasiveness that had defined his conduct from the moment he'd first ridden into the Pueblo's central square. She understood, eventually, that whatever considerable skill and tactical understanding he demonstrated across the preceding week had been built through circumstances he genuinely did not intend to share, and she found herself, watching him prepare to depart on the morning of his 4th day, considerably more curious about the man himself than she'd allowed herself to fully acknowledge. "You're leaving," she said, finding him securing his saddlebags in the Pueblo's early morning light. "There's considerable work left in places like this one," the stranger said. "I don't believe I'm the kind of man who's built for staying anywhere particularly long, regardless of how genuinely I've come to respect what this Pueblo's managed to preserve despite everything Valali's men put it through." Petra studied him for a long moment. "Why did you actually help us?" she asked again, understanding this would likely be her final opportunity to ask the question directly. "I understand what you told me about debts that don't require personal history. I don't fully believe that's the complete answer, though." The stranger considered the question with genuine, visible weight. "I've lost people in circumstances not entirely unlike what nearly happened to you," he said finally. "I couldn't help them when it mattered most. I've spent considerable time since trying to make sure that failure means something, by helping where I genuinely can, even when the people I'm helping have no particular claim on my own history. That's the most honest answer I've got, Petra. I don't believe it's the complete one, but it's considerably more truth than I've offered most people in longer than I care to count." He offered her, before mounting his horse for departure, a single silver coin, a gesture that carried, in its specific simplicity, considerably more weight than the modest monetary value itself might have suggested. "For rabbit snares," he said, echoing, with quiet, deliberate intention, the exact reason she'd originally been bound to that post in the Pueblo square. "Or for whatever your family genuinely needs most, now that the drought and Valali's men are no longer the only considerations shaping what survival actually requires of you. I understand a single coin doesn't undo 6 hours tied in the sun, or 18 months of lawlessness this Pueblo endured before I happened to ride through. I'd like to think it means something regardless." Petra closed her hand around the coin, understanding, with genuine and considerable emotion, exactly what the gesture represented beyond its simple monetary value. A specific acknowledgement that her hunger, her desperation, and the theft it had driven her toward had never actually been the crime that mattered in this story, regardless of what Valali's men had claimed to be enforcing. "Thank you," she said, "for considerably more than the coin, stranger. I don't even know your name." The stranger mounted his horse with the same unhurried, deliberate economy that had defined his arrival days earlier. "Names carry considerably less weight than what a man actually does with the time he's given," he said. "I'd suggest you remember this Pueblo's own story, rather than mine, when you're deciding what today actually meant. You and Conpan, and everyone else who spent 18 months surviving what law abandoned. That's the story genuinely worth remembering." He rode out of the Pueblo the same way he'd entered it, at an unhurried, measured pace that carried no particular urgency, disappearing eventually into the same open country that had first brought him, without explanation or fanfare, into a place where justice had been absent for considerably longer than anyone still living there could clearly remember. Some men build their reputations through the specific, careful accumulation of stories other people tell about them, legends that grow larger and less accurate with every retelling, until the actual truth of who they were becomes almost entirely irrelevant to the myth that eventually survives them. This particular stranger left the Pueblo with no name attached to what he'd done there, no lasting monument beyond the specific, quiet gratitude of a woman who'd been tied to a post over a single stolen bullet, and a community that had, for the first time in 18 months, genuinely remembered what it felt like to live somewhere justice hadn't entirely abandoned. Some truths, carried unknowingly by even the most careless men, prove powerful enough on their own to restore what violence and fear had spent considerable time trying to permanently erase. It took a fearless stranger, and the simple, undeniable weight of proof those men had carelessly left exposed beneath a bottle of mezcal, to prove exactly how much that particular truth was still worth. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you genuinely. This channel, Storyrealm Hub, exists entirely because of stories like this one, and every single like, subscribe, and comment makes a real difference in how many people get to find them. If this story earned it, do those 3 things right now, and tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest for you. I read every single one. See you in the next story.